Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tariq Khalil, and as a member of the American Muslims for Palestine in Chicago, I'm here on behalf of the Chicago Coalition for Justice in Palestine. And we, as a coalition, stand firmly against the UAE and Bahrain normalization agreements with Israel. Today, the United States hosted a ceremony to consummate the normalization agreements between Bahrain and Israel. Absent from this debacle of White House theatrics was Palestinians who were not able to represent their own rights in their own struggle. This is euphemistically coined the Abrahamic Accord. The details of the plan unveil little more than a calculated semantics ploy to represent the anti-colonial struggle of the indigenous Palestinians as a religious and fratricidal fight between the children of Abraham. Make no mistake, the struggle in Palestine is not between Islam and Judaism. It is a struggle between colonizer and colonized, occupier and occupied, dispossessor and dispossessed. In international arenas, this farce has been touted as a peace initiative, even though the countries parties to the agreement were never in conflict with one another. This deal between Bahrain, the UAE, and Israel isn't so much a peace agreement as a business deal to facilitate arms sales. It is not an agreement to further peace. It's an agreement to further settler colonialism. It's an agreement to further annexation, apartheid, occupation, and quell the liberation struggle of Palestinians and diminish their claims for justice under international law. While governments and corporations talk of business opportunity, tourism, and energy deals, the Palestinians continue to exist in apartheid conditions under brutal Israeli military occupation, where home demolitions, night raids, arbitrary arrests, administrative detention, and unspeakable harassment, humiliation, settler violence, and collective punishment continue on a daily basis. While we condemn the actions of the UAE and Bahrain governments, we know that the Arab people of the UAE and Bahrain and throughout the Arab world remain firm in their support for Palestinian rights. Likewise, we condemn the long role of the US government in pushing normalization with apartheid. We know that our fellow Americans want the US government to promote justice and liberation. The American people want their tax dollars spent on our crumbling education system, compromised infrastructure and healthcare, not to prop up human rights abusers, nor to increase the bank accounts of weapons contractors. As a part of a national coalition of over 50 US-based religious, political, cultural, and human rights organizations, representing tens of thousands of Americans, we stand firmly with the Palestinian people in their fight for freedom, self-determination, and demand that Israel be held accountable for its crimes. We stand united in our rejection of any and all efforts to normalize with Israel at the expense of Palestine and the Palestinian people. We declare here and now that Palestinian self-determination and human rights are non-negotiable and not for sale. And finally, and most importantly, we demand an end to Zionist settler colonialism and Zionist colonization of Arab and Palestinian land. I want to invite our next speaker, Abdullah Mitchell, from the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago. Please, let's hear.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace to all gathered here this afternoon. I stand before you and join in the call to condemn this accord that has been reached between the nations of Israel, Bahrain, and the UAE. And I stand here not to condemn it for the reasons that Tariq mentioned earlier. He's laid out the case why it should be rejected. And I don't stand against this because trade and commerce is a good thing among nations. I stand against this because as a person of faith, our nation's leaders have made an immoral choice. An immoral choice to choose money over people. The sanctity of life subordinated to commerce and trade. For while we extol the virtues of how this is going to increase trade, well, for over a decade, there's been no trade in Gaza. No exports, few imports. They extol the virtues of travel. Well, a 10-year blockade is restricting people to go out and make a gainly livelihood in this area. How has it impacted the lives of people in Gaza, where unemployment is reported to be as high as 43%, and the nation and the people of Gaza are depending on international aid to meet their daily needs. When we, as a nation, place money above people, we are forsaking the very values that are the bedrock of this nation. And as faith-minded people, I ask each and every one of you to call out your legislative leaders, remind them, scold them that this is a wrong choice. It doesn't take 10 years to resolve the issues that exist in Palestine. It requires a will to be rightful, just, and righteous in that pursuit. Thank you.
I want to invite Pauline Kaufman from the Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church USA and a longtime advocate for a just peace in Palestine.
Salam alaikum, peace to everyone. Greetings from the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church USA. We speak to the church and our community from our perspective as advocates for a just peace for Palestine and Israel. We have traveled there, seen the apartheid conditions, and we follow the reports daily. We are appalled by this so-called peace agreement with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Israel, aided and abetted by the United States of America. It's clearly an agreement that normalizes conditions in the Middle East and ignores the human rights of Palestinians. While both Arab states celebrate their ability to engage in trade and commerce with Israel, we all know the real impetus for the agreement is the ability of both the Emirates and Bahrain to purchase high-tech weapons from the United States. Noura Erakat, human rights attorney and assistant professor at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and the author of Justice for Some, says, as a result of this agreement with Israel, the UAE was able to purchase high-tech weapons from the United States, including Reaper drones, EA-18G Growler jets, and F-35 fighter planes. Bahrain, which stands to similarly benefit as it seeks air defense systems from the United States, is yet another Arab state eager to secure the superpower's military backing and diplomatic impunity for gross violations of human rights and the laws of war. Just been faced with the statistics that the U.S. response to 9/11 has resulted in 37 million refugees in the world. There are a lot more than that. This is just the ones from the Middle East. Mean more violence and more destruction. When will we stop this madness? The growing awareness of these wrong-headed agreements means we will continue to call for a fair approach to Palestinian-Israeli efforts that result in real peace. Just as we support Black Lives Matter, we support Palestinian human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline Kaufman. Next up, we have Lynn Pollock from the Jewish Voice for Peace.
So, hello everyone. I'm here today speaking on behalf of Jewish Voice for Peace, closer, which is a national member-driven organization dedicated to a U.S. foreign policy based on peace, human rights, respect for international law, and most of all, solidarity with Palestinians. And thank you, AMP, for inviting JVP to participate in this event. So this development, normalizing relationships with Israel, is anything but normal. You know, we're living in crazy times, and much of what people in this country and around the world consider normal is completely bonkers. I first got actively involved in the struggle for Palestinian lives and rights nearly 20 years ago when reading alternative media like the Electronic Intifada revealed to me that what we were learning about the Second Intifada was seriously slanted. Where were the Palestinians in this story? How were they being portrayed? Millions of brave and steadfast people trying to live their lives under a brutal occupation were completely erased from the story, granted an unwanted cloak of invisibility. Today, thanks in part to those insisting that you can't be progressive except for Palestine, more and more people are aware of the daily injustices inflicted upon Palestinians, but still too many seem blind to Palestinian existence or the struggle against a very real occupation. So, and now, not only are the Palestinians suffering from this continuing occupation and dispossession and other horrific obstacles to living a normal life, during this pandemic, healthcare is sparse, especially in Gaza, and Palestinian prisoners, even children, are living in horrific conditions. And while Trumpsters, Israeli boosters, and way too many of the misled public are being sold these recent agreements with Bahrain and the UAE as breakthrough peace agreements, they are nothing more than flimsy bricks in the wall of Israeli cynical intransigence. And as a Jew, I am appalled, though not surprised, that major Jewish organizations in this country, even so-called progressive ones like J Street, applaud this recent batch of so-called peace agreements with Israel. Nary a mention of the Palestinian struggle, as though it's magically disappeared. It makes me ashamed to be a Jew, I'll tell you. But I assure you that Jewish Voice for Peace is in this struggle with you all the way. Here's to being seen.
Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! End the occupation now! End the occupation now! Not another nickel, not another dime, no more money for Israel's crimes! Not another nickel, not another dime, no more money for Israel's crimes!
Not another nickel, not another dime, no more money for Israel's crimes!
All right, I hope that woke you guys up a little bit. Next up, we have Jennifer Bing. She's the program director of the Palestine Activism program of the American Friends Service Committee. Please give it up for Jennifer Bing.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Nida and members of the Chicago Palestinian community for inviting me to be with you today while President Trump stages new photo ops for fake peace plans at the White House. Like we have had to do over many years and with many U.S. administrations, we gather to protest yet another U.S. attempt to broker a Middle East plan that ignores human rights, international law and the desire for people to live in freedom. My message today is directed to Congress, right up there. Please stop the ridiculous pronouncements that what is happening today at the White House brings peace and prosperity to benefit all people in the Middle East. Let's be clear. This administration's efforts undermine the prospect for peace. Just look at the last 4 years under the Trump administration. Critical aid for refugees was cut. In violation of brokered negotiations, Trump formally recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and the U.S. Embassy was moved. All White House objections to further expansion of Israeli settlements was stopped, and a blockade enforcing the imprisonment of 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza was continued, resulting in more poverty, death, and shattered dreams. Elected leaders, we need your voices to speak up and stop actions that lead to more human suffering and war. With a stroke of a pen today, President Trump signs an investment in more war for the Middle East. Already, the U.S. sends billions of weapons to the Middle East, ignoring the human rights record of the governments who add to their weapons arsenals. As an example, a key incentive for the Gulf countries signing into normalization with Israel is the U.S.'s promise to sell more weapons, including F-35 fighter jets, a stealth weapon designed for first strike ability. F-35s are the most expensive weapons program in history, with a cost of $1.5 trillion. The U.S. wasted funds developing this killing machine rather than investing in our communities here in the United States. Just like his predecessors in the White House, the president is seeking a new world order in the Middle East, one fueled by U.S. militarism, not one that prioritizes funds to support refugees and populations impoverished by decades of military occupation and corrupted governments. Now is the time for our U.S. senators and representatives in Illinois to embrace efforts in Congress to withhold U.S. taxpayer funds that are used to further annex Palestinian lands, expand Israeli settler colonies, and detain and abuse Palestinian children in Israeli prisons. House Resolution 2407 and 8050 are two important bills that all Illinois representatives should support. Congress needs to stop arms sales and military cooperation with regimes who violate human rights. We need to divest from profiting from war and military occupation. We must create agreements where true peace and security is built on a respect for international law, equal rights, justice, and freedom for all people. I am proud to live in the state of Illinois with the largest Palestinian American community in the United States. Together, through our networks of solidarity, we will not be silent as Palestinian rights are sidelined by governments who put profits over people's rights. We will not rest, even in a pandemic, to advocate for a future where the dreams of a life lived in dignity are available to all. Shukran, thank you. Shukran, thank you.
Next up, member of the Students Justice for Palestine, co-chair of SJP Chicago, and SJP is the most fearless group of people you will ever meet. They are the future.
Peace be upon you all. But as we gather today on the occasion of these deals between Israel, Bahrain, and the UAE, let us be clear that peace is not what is on the table. My name is Malak, and I represent Students for Justice in Palestine, Chicago, a coalition for SJP chapters from across 9 university campuses in the Chicagoland area. As a voice for young Palestinian and Arab activists from across the city, I am speaking today to express our condemnation for the so-called peace deals between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel. We must understand 3 things. 1, that Israel's failed promise to annex the West Bank this summer has amounted to a public relations nightmare, exposing the inherently settler colonial interests of Zionism, revealing that a 2-state solution was never Israel's intentions, and prompting more public criticism of Israeli ethno-nationalism than ever before. 2, that these Gulf governments who do not represent the politics of their people have sought trade and security cooperation with Israel for years, not out of the desire to bring peace to the region, but to further their own economic and nationalistic interests. 3, that Donald Trump, whose campaign has struggled to present any sort of positive foreign policy record before the election, needs the public image of a successful peacemaking administration in order to capture voters. After his politically embarrassing plan, released in January, rejected even by Netanyahu, these deals recuperate Trump's weak diplomatic image just in time for his hopeful re-election. Peace cannot be achieved when it excludes the voices of the oppressed. These peace deals between nations that have never been at war prey on the false narrative of the conflict. As we celebrate a handshake between the Arab leaders and the Israelis, Palestine is removed entirely from the equation, and the apartheid regime which Palestinians live is forgotten. We remind you that peace is not coming as a result of these business deals. How dare we speak of peace when Palestinians still live under siege and under occupation? When we talk of peace without freedom for Palestine, we talk only of normalization, of accepting Israeli apartheid, accepting the second-class status of Israel's Palestinian citizens, and accepting the reservations across the West Bank and Gaza, where the Israeli state controls the native Palestinian population. Until these injustices are remedied, we can do nothing but condemn our Zionist oppressors, and condemn those Arab leaders who have turned their backs upon our cause. UAE is leading a nation into supporting the oppressors of their brothers and sisters. To see children waving the Israeli flag while Israel murders and imprisons innocent Palestinian children will not be tolerated. As the future of Palestine activism in Chicago and America, we, Students for Justice in Palestine, hope to one day stand here and pronounce the arrival of peace. Until then, we urge you to continue listening to Palestinian voices, seeing clearly that our government will not, and we urge you, before looking for peace in the Middle East, to really work to understand the injustices at hand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malak. Give her a hand. SJP. Free, free Palestine. Free, free Palestine. End the occupation now. End the occupation now. Next up, we have Paula Roderick from Friends of Sabine. Please come on up, Paula.
This is like coming home. I'm looking around and I see friends. I see people that I have been out in the streets with day after day. It is such a good feeling to be here. My name is Paula Roderick. I am Black. I am Creole. I am an attorney. My pronouns are she, her, and they, and I stand on land that is unceded Native American land. And I'm a member here representing Friends of Sabine, North America. I'm also a proud supporter of the Black Church call to end Israeli occupation. About FOSNA. It's a non-exempt Christian ecumenical organization. It seeks justice and peace in the Holy Land through nonviolent advocacy and education. And Sabeel is an international peace movement initiated by Palestinian Christians. Give it up for Palestinian Christians. We know that this is not about religion, this is about occupation and oppression, who seek a just peace as defined by international law and existing United Nations resolutions. FOSNA rejects the choice of the UAE to sign agreements with Israel and the United States, formalizing its complicity with a settler colonial country, stealing Palestinian land, implementing apartheid policies, denying Palestinians basic human rights daily. As a Christian ecumenical liberation organization, our theology teaches us that the only way to true peace, justice, and liberation is by following the lead of the most marginalized, those most affected. Unlike any of the actors in today's ceremony, we follow the leadership of the Palestinian people in their struggle for justice. We understand liberation as giving voice to the prophetic leaders of a community to determine their own fate. FOSNA has been seeking justice in Palestine for over 20 years. We recognize that the president's actions, once again, are not in line with Christian values. We particularly denounce the participation in today's event of 4 staff members and leaders of Christians United for Israel, CUFI, for misusing Christianity to justify Israel's abhorrent actions. As Americans, we call upon our government to make amends for our own ongoing settler colonial theft of the indigenous land from Mauna Kea to Standing Rock. And call on our government to repair the harm done to Black Americans rather than celebrating and underwriting the continued colonization of Palestinians. With 10 million of our tax dollars going to Israel every day in the form of military funding, we know that the true winner of this agreement will be the arms dealers and cyber spying contractors that promote militarism and destroy human rights. In a moment when millions are standing with Black Lives Matter and marginalized communities here, calling for a reprioritization of funds to basic community needs, instead of policing and militarism, we condemn this agreement, which does exactly the opposite. Already, 2 Israeli banks who finance the illegal Israeli settlements have opened in the UAE. In response, we call on denominations, on institutions, on cities to follow the lead of the United Methodist Church in divesting from Israeli banks. That's right, divest, BDS. We call for all Americans to join the Invest in Justice campaign and encourage our representatives to end all U.S. military aid to Israel until they end their violations of international law and human basic civil rights. We say no to normalization with occupation, with racism, and with colonization. And we say hashtag no, right, no to normalization. Thank you.
Not another nickel, not another dime, no more money for Israel's crimes. Next up, we have an activist with Chicago Faith Coalition for Middle East Policy and ambassador for Bright Stars of Beit Lahem, Rosanna Thompson.
Thank you. I stand here representing Chicago Faith Coalition for Middle Eastern Peace and Justice. And as a person of faith, an American, a Palestinian, a Christian, I have a little story to share with you. A few years ago, I held up this piece of olive wood artwork at a church locally with parents and children and asked, what language do you think they speak in the city where Jesus Christ was born? And they said Hebrew, and they said English, and then they got frustrated, and I said no. And one kid said, Latin? And I said, the artisan that made this olive work souvenir speaks Arabic, like the rest of the population in Bethlehem, 1 out of 5 of which is a Palestinian Christian, an indigenous citizen. These incidents emerge from the damaging rhetoric of Christian Zionism, led by a well-financed organizations like Christians United for Israel, CUFI. John Hagee, the chairman of this organization, led the prayer on May 14th, 2018 in Jerusalem when the U.S. moved its embassy from Tel Aviv. And today, John Hagee is at the White House ceremony endorsing this so-called deal that is being signed between the UAE, Israel, and Bahrain with the U.S. support. He's going to deliver a message to the 9 million members of Kufi that are going to believe what he has to say, hailing this as a victory led by God and delivering peace. This is called faith washing. It is a persuasive strategy that has ignited Islamophobia and leads to anti-Semitism, and it must be called what it is. Faith washing obscures Palestinian identity by creating a sense that this is a religious war between Muslims and Jews or Muslims and Christians, and it's not. And today, with the UAE-Israel deal, it is more clear than ever that this is not racial reconciliation. This is business, this is commerce, this is military funding. We cannot tolerate these violent policies like shoot to kill that emerge from this idea of dehumanizing the Palestinians and the erasure of our identity, our culture, our art, and our right to self-determination for statehood and our land. Bethlehem and other regions of the West Bank are crushed under settler colonial oppression, the de facto annexation of their land, the demolition of their properties, the taking down of their orchards, their olive trees. De facto annexation does not stop just because the UAE and Bahrain have signed a deal with Israel. De facto annexation has been cutting apart the West Bank and continues to do so, partitioning it into little parcels that can be claimed by settler outposts and injustice and violence. And as a Palestinian, as a Christian, if I see myself through the lens of Zionism, which today governments are normalizing with applause and approval from our US government and the pro-Israel lobby, then I have to accept that erasure of my heritage, Palestinian identity, and I will not accept it. Thank you. For the record, Bethlehem is in Palestine. Fact check me. It's in Area A, and Israel has made it illegal for their own citizens to cross their checkpoint through the security wall that they built, so that it's illegal even if they wanted to see the Church of the Nativity. Today, I call upon each and every one of you, members of Congress, co-sign HR 2407 and HR 8050. Speak truth to power. We will not normalize these relations. Thank you for your stand for justice and peace.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. Now, last but not least, we have a representative from the U.S. Palestinian Community Network, Hussam Marajda.
The last one I had. Oh, it's okay. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Hussam Marajda. I'm a member of the U.S. Palestinian Community Network and Chicago Coalition, the Coalition for Justice in Palestine in Chicago. I want to thank you all for coming out here, the CJP and our friends, for coming out today and speaking on the recent developments in the Arab world. Just to be clear, this process of normalization is not new. In recent history, a number of Arab leaders and countries have openly and secretly normalized with the Zionist state of Israel. This does not come as a surprise to any of us here. And let's not kid ourselves into thinking that this is some kind of a peace agreement. It does not bring peace to our people in the Arab world. It brings nothing but an expansion of markets and capital that benefits the business and corporate elites of the countries involved. It formalizes the business relationships that the US, Israel, UAE, and Bahrain have already had for years. History will not absolve these sellout leaders of UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and others, the US puppets who have always sold out the Palestinian cause. And let's be clear about something else. This will not in any way change the material conditions faced by the Palestinians on the ground. The annexation plan was not halted because of a deal with the UAE, but because of the worldwide resistance to US support of Israeli colonization and occupation of our lands. The Palestinian, Arab, and world streets already reject these agreements and will remain steadfast in fighting for our full liberation from the river to the sea. And here in the United States, we have a duty to keep on fighting. And here are 2 ways that you can help. The sister already mentioned them. First, you could urge your reps to sign on to HR 2407, No Way to Cheat a Child. This bill would prevent US foreign military financing from being used by Israel to militarily detain, interrogate, abuse, or impose ill treatment upon children in violation of international law. And second, urge your reps to support the Israeli Annexation Non-Recognition Act, HR 8050. This legislation would prohibit US recognition of Israeli annexation of Palestinian land in the West Bank and would cut off all forms of US funding to Israel used to directly or indirectly support annexation. From the river to the sea, from the river to the sea,
Palestine will be free.
From the river to the sea,
Palestine will be free.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Hassan. I want to thank the Faith Coalition for coming. I want to thank all member organizations of the Coalition for Justice in Palestine. Thank you all for showing up. Thank you all for standing firmly for justice, for liberation. We have a lot of work to do. We must never give up. And it is our duty to make sure that we continue the fight and the struggle for the liberation of Palestine. Thank you. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! End the occupation now! End the occupation now! Not another nickel, not another dime! No more money for Israel's crimes! Not another nickel, not another dime! Not another nickel, not another dime! Thank you all for coming out.